Did you ever imagine a time when unmarried women could hold immense religious power enough to pardon condemned criminals in ancient Rome just by encountering them? What if there were entire medieval towns, almost exclusively populated and run by women, who lived pious lives but without the strict, lifelong vows of a nun? Could women in centuries past create their own fulfilling households, forging deep bonds in intellectual communities entirely separate from husbands or fathers? And what if the very centers of intellectual and artistic revolutions were not universities or royal courts, but the living rooms of unmarried or widowed women, prepared to journey through history to discover some truly astonishing places where single women found community purpose and sometimes surprising levels of freedom? Number 5. The sparkling salons where women ruled ideas. Imagine stepping off a bustling Parisian street in the 17th or 18th century. You leave behind the clatter of carriages and the calls of street vendors. You enter a refined townhouse, and suddenly the air is different. It is alive with conversation, with laughter, with the sharp exchange of new ideas. And at the center of it all, guiding the discourse, introducing thinkers, and shaping the very culture of an era, is a woman. She might be unmarried. She might be widowed. But here, in her salon, she is a queen. These were not just fancy tea parties. The salons of Paris and later across Europe were crucibles of intellectual and artistic development. Think of them as unofficial universities. Think tanks and art galleries all rolled into one, and often hosted by women who, by virtue of their unmarried or widowed status, had the time, the resources, and the freedom from domestic obligations to dedicate themselves to these influential gatherings. One of the earliest and most famous salon hostesses was Catherine de Vivonne, Marquise de Rambouillet. In the early 1600s, dissatisfied with the crude manners of the French court, she decided to create her own refined social space within her Parisian home, the Hôtel de Rambouillet. She had the house remodeled, creating a suite of small rooms leading off from her main reception room, the famous Chambre Bleue or Blue Room. This innovative design allowed for more intimate conversations and varied groupings of guests. For decades, from around 1607 until her health declined in the 1650s, Madame de Rambouillet's salon was the place to be for the French aristocracy and literary figures. Here, writers like Pierre Corneille and François de Malherbe mingled with high-born ladies and gentlemen. They discussed literature, language, manners, and love. The salonnières, as these hostesses came to be known, were not passive listeners. They actively copied the guest lists, guided conversations, and fostered talent. They were patrons, critics, and intellectual partners. For an unmarried woman of means, or a widow, hosting a salon offered a unique platform for influence and intellectual engagement, a world away from the often limited roles available to women at the time. As the 18th century dawned, the nature of salons evolved, becoming more focused on Enlightenment ideas. Thinkers like Voltaire, Rousseau, Diderot, and Montesquieu frequented these gatherings. And women were often at the heart of these intellectual powerhouses. Madame de Tencin, an ex-nun who had her vows nullified, became a prominent literary hostess. Her salon was a launching pad for Montesquieu's The Spirit of the Laws, and a regular meeting place for contributors to the great encyclopedia. She was known for her intelligence, her wit, and her ability to manage complex personalities. For an unmarried woman like her, the salon was a way to exert considerable cultural power. Then there was Madame Chefrin. Marie-Thérèse Rodet-Chefrin was married, but her husband was famously quiet and unobtrusive, leaving her free to become one of the most influential salonnières of the Enlightenment. After his death, she came into her own even more. For over 25 years, her salon was a hub of intellectual life in Paris. She hosted 2 regular dinners, one for artists on Mondays and one for writers and philosophers on Wednesdays. She provided financial support to many artists and writers, including Denis Diderot and Jean-Laurent d'Alembert for their encyclopedia project. She was not an intellectual herself, in the sense of writing books, but she was a master facilitator, a talent scout, and a generous patron. Her salon was so famous that distinguished foreigners like Horace Walpole and David Hume made it a point to visit. Imagine the scene. Men who were changing the course of Western thought gathered in her rooms, debating, discussing, fueled by her hospitality and guided by her social acumen. This was a woman who, without holding any official position, shaped the intellectual landscape of her time. What made these salons havens for certain unmarried or widowed women? They offered a sphere of influence and intellectual stimulation that was largely unavailable elsewhere. While societal expectations for most women revolved around marriage and motherhood, the salon offered an alternative path to significance. It required intelligence, social skill, and often independent means. For women who possessed these qualities, the salon was a space where their talents could shine. They were not just accessories. They were architects of culture. Of course, it was not a perfect utopia. Salons were largely the domain of the wealthy and well-connected, and salonnières still had to navigate societal expectations and potential criticism. Some were accused of trying to usurp male roles or of being too forward. Yet they persisted, creating spaces where ideas could flourish, where new literary forms were born, and where artists and thinkers found crucial support. The salonnières, often unmarried or widowed, demonstrated that women could be powerful intellectual catalysts, creating unexpected centers of influence and community from within their own homes. They built havens not of physical safety, but of intellectual freedom and cultural power, leaving a lasting legacy on art, literature, and thought. These women did not just witness history. They actively shaped it, using their drawing rooms as their stage and their intellect as their scepter. Number 4. The quiet sisterhoods of New England spinsters. Across the Atlantic in a different century, another kind of unexpected haven for unmarried women was taking shape. Not in grand Parisian townhouses, but in the quieter towns and villages of New England during the 18th and 19th centuries. This was a world far removed from the glittering salons, yet it offered its own forms of independence and deep supportive community for women who chose or found themselves outside the conventional path of marriage. Following the American Revolution and through much of the 1800s, particularly in New England, there was often a surplus of women. Wars had taken a toll on the male population, and westward expansion frequently drew more men than women. This demographic reality meant that not all women could or would marry. Society still largely expected women to be wives and mothers, and the term spinster could carry a weight of pity or even scorn. But in this environment, many unmarried women forged alternative paths, creating lives of meaning, purpose, and mutual support. These women often found economic independence through professions newly opening to them, or through traditional female skills. Teaching became a significant avenue. As the common school movement grew, there was a demand for teachers, and unmarried women were often seen as ideal candidates, supposedly more nurturing and crucially cheaper to hire than men. For many young women, teaching offered a respectable way to earn a living, see a bit of the world beyond their hometown, and contribute to society. Authorship was another path. Women like Catherine Maria Sedgwick and Lydia Maria Child became successful writers, their novels and domestic advice books shaping American culture and providing them with income. Others engaged in skilled trades like dressmaking, millinery, or running small shops. What made this a haven was not a specific type of building, but the social structures and personal relationships these women built. Sometimes, this took the form of two unmarried women, often referred to as spinsters or maiden aunts, choosing to live together. These arrangements, later sometimes romanticized or specifically termed Boston marriages, when they involved educated professional women in long-term partnerships, provided companionship, economic sharing, and emotional support. Such households were common enough to be unremarkable in many communities. Two sisters might live together after their parents passed, or two friends might decide to pool their resources. They ran their homes, managed their finances, and created a domestic world on their own terms. Consider the lives of Sarah Orne Jewett, a celebrated Maine author of the late 19th century, and Annie Adams Fields. Annie Fields was the widow of publisher James T. Fields. After his death, she and Sarah Orne Jewett formed a deep, loving partnership, living and traveling together for many years. Their home in Boston became a literary center, much like a salon, albeit on a more intimate American scale. They supported each other's work and created a rich intellectual and emotional life together. Their relationship, and others like it, offered a profound alternative to traditional marriage. It was a haven of mutual affection, intellectual companionship, and shared domesticity. These female-centered households were not always explicitly romantic in the modern sense, but they were invariably built on strong bonds of loyalty and mutual care. In a society that often viewed unmarried women as somehow incomplete or dependent, these women demonstrated a powerful capacity for self-reliance and for creating fulfilling lives. They formed networks of support that extended beyond their own households. Female friendships were intensely valued, and women relied on each other for help, in times of sickness, for advice, and for simple companionship. Churches and charitable societies also provided avenues for unmarried women to engage in meaningful community work and find fellowship. The independence these women carved out was hard-won. Economically, they were often more precarious than their married counterparts. Socially, they might face pressure or condescension, yet the sheer number of women who lived full and respected lives outside of marriage in New England during this period is a testament to their resilience and creativity. They built havens not of brick and mortar, but of shared lives, mutual support, and quiet defiance of convention. They showed that a woman's life could be complete and significant without a husband, finding solace, purpose, and deep connection in the company of other women. These were the unassuming havens of the New England spinsters, where independence was cultivated and sisterhood was a powerful life-sustaining force. Created spaces where they could be themselves, support one another, and contribute to their communities in ways that were meaningful to them, proving that a life outside the expected norms could indeed be a rich and rewarding one. Number 3. The Enlightened Paths of Buddhist Nuns in Asia. Journey eastward, and far back in time, to discover another extraordinary haven for women, the Buddhist nunneries of Asia. For well over 2,000 years, these monastic communities have offered women a path to spiritual development, education, and a life dedicated to higher purpose, often providing a profound alternative to the societal expectation of marriage and domesticity. The tradition of female monastics or bhikkhunis in Buddhism dates back to the very lifetime of the Buddha Siddhartha Gautama in ancient India, around the 5th century before Common Era. According to Buddhist scriptures, it was the Buddha's aunt and foster mother, Mahapajapati Gautami, who first requested permission for women to be ordained. After some initial hesitation, the Buddha consented, establishing the Bhikkhuni Sangha, or Order of Nuns. This was a radical step for its time, offering women a recognized religious role and a path to enlightenment on par with men. What drew women to these nunneries? The reasons were as varied as the women themselves. Some sought spiritual liberation, a direct path to understanding the nature of reality and ending suffering, as taught by the Buddha. For others, it was an escape from difficult worldly circumstances. Unhappy marriages, the grief of losing children or husbands, the burdens of poverty or the oppressive limitations of a patriarchal society. The Therigatha, or Verses of the Elder Nuns, a collection of poems in the Pali Canon, gives voice to these early Buddhist nuns. Their verses are startlingly personal and powerful, expressing the joy of their spiritual freedom, their relief at leaving behind domestic drudgery, and their profound insights. One nun, Mutta, wrote of her freedom. "So free am I, so gloriously free. Free from the three crooked things, mortar, pestle, and my crooked old husband. Free from birth and death and all that dragged me back." These are not just ancient texts. They are vibrant testimonies to the appeal of the nun's life. Life in a Buddhist nunnery was, and is, structured around discipline, study, meditation, and community service. Nuns typically shave their heads and wear simple robes symbolizing their renunciation of worldly vanity. Their days involve chanting, studying Buddhist scriptures, practicing various forms of meditation to cultivate mindfulness and wisdom, and performing chores to maintain the nunnery. Many nunneries also became centers of learning, providing women with an education in literacy, philosophy, and medicine that they might not have received otherwise. In some traditions and periods, nuns became respected scholars, teachers, and meditation masters, guiding both lay followers and other monastics. The status and flourishing of Buddhist nunneries have varied across different Asian countries and historical periods. In some regions, like Sri Lanka and parts of Southeast Asia, the full ordination lineage for bhikkhunis died out for centuries, though it has seen revival in modern times. In other areas, such as Tibet, China, Korea, and Taiwan, the tradition of nuns remained strong or was re-established with vigor. For example, Tibetan nunneries, nestled high in the Himalayas, have long provided a rigorous path of study and practice for women. Despite immense challenges, especially in recent history, these communities have shown incredible resilience. In Taiwan, organizations like the Foguan Shan and Tzu Chi, both founded by or with strong participation of nuns, have become global Buddhist movements known for their educational and charitable work. These nunneries were havens in multiple senses. Spiritually, they offered a dedicated environment for pursuing enlightenment. Socially, they provided a supportive community of women, a sisterhood bound by shared vows and aspirations. Intellectually, they were often places of learning and scholarship. And practically, they offered a refuge from the often unforgiving demands placed on women in lay society. For a woman who did not wish to marry, or who had suffered in marriage, or who simply felt a powerful calling to a spiritual life, the nunnery was a viable, respected, and empowering alternative. Of course, life as a nun was not without its challenges. Nunneries often received less financial support than male monasteries. Nuns sometimes faced greater obstacles in accessing higher levels of textual education or recognition for their spiritual attainments compared to their male counterparts. Yet, despite these hurdles, millions of women throughout Asian history have chosen this path. They found in the saffron or gray robes, in the quiet halls of the nunnery, and in the profound teachings of the Buddha, a haven where they could cultivate wisdom, compassion, and an inner freedom that transcended societal constraints. These serene sanctuaries stand as a testament to women's enduring quest for spiritual meaning and self-determination, offering a path to enlightenment that was, for its time and place, remarkably inclusive and liberating. Number 2. The self-governed sanctuaries of medieval beguines. Picture medieval Europe, a world often dominated by rigid social structures, the authority of the church, and limited options for women outside of marriage or the cloistered life of a nunnery. Yet beginning in the late 12th and flourishing in the 13th and 14th centuries, a remarkable and largely independent women's movement swept across parts of Northern Europe, particularly in the Low Countries, modern Belgium and Netherlands, Germany, and northern France. These women were known as Beguines, and they created unique communities, sometimes entire walled towns within towns, that served as unexpected havens of spiritual devotion, economic independence, and communal living, all without taking permanent vows. Who were these Beguines? They were lay women, not nuns. They did not take lifelong vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, though they lived pious, chaste lives while residing in the Beguinage. They dedicated themselves to prayer, contemplation, and often charitable work or manual labor to support themselves. Crucially, they retained a degree of freedom unheard of for most women of their era. A Beguine could own property. She could leave the Beguinage if she chose, perhaps to marry or to return to her family. This flexibility was a key distinction from traditional monastic orders. The rise of the Beguine movement coincided with a period of intense religious fervor and demographic shifts. There was a surplus of women in many urban centers, partly due to men participating in crusades or dying in conflicts, and also because dowry requirements made marriage inaccessible for some. At the same time, many women felt a deep desire for a spiritual life, but were unwilling or unable to enter traditional convents, which often required substantial dowries, and were sometimes seen as too worldly or not offering enough personal spiritual expression. The Beguines offered a third way, a life of religious devotion and community, lived semi-independently in the world. The guinages. The communities where these women lived varied in form. Some were small, informal groups of women sharing a house. Others grew into large, highly organized complexes, often enclosed by walls, with their own church or chapel, hospital workshops, and individual houses or communal dormitories. The Grand Beguinage of Leuven in Belgium, for example, which still stands today as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, resembles a small town with streets, squares, gardens, and dozens of houses. These were, in essence, women's towns. They elected their own leaders, known as grand dames or mistresses, who managed the community's affairs. Economically, Beguines were remarkably self-sufficient. Many engaged in textile work, spinning, weaving, and cloth production, which was a booming industry in cities like Bruges, Ghent, and Antwerp. Others took in laundry, cared for the sick in their infirmaries or in private homes, a precursor to organized nursing, or taught children. Their labor not only supported themselves, but also contributed to the urban economy. This economic independence was a vital component of their autonomy. They were not reliant on male relatives or solely on charitable donations, though they did receive support from pious benefactors. The spiritual life of the Beguines was rich and often intensely personal. They practiced private prayer, attended communal services, and many were drawn to mystical forms of spirituality. Some Beguines became renowned mystics and writers articulating their profound spiritual experiences. Hadewich of Antwerp, a 13th century Beguine, wrote powerful poetry and prose about her ecstatic visions of divine love. Mechthild of Magdeburg, who lived for a time as a Beguine, penned The Flowing Light of the Godhead, a seminal work of German mysticism. Marguerite Porete, another Beguine writer, authored The Mirror of Simple Souls, a mystical treatise that was deemed heretical by church authorities, leading to her tragic execution in 1310. This brings us to the challenges Beguines faced. Their independence and unconventional status sometimes aroused suspicion from established church and secular authorities. Without the strict oversight of a male-led religious order, and with some Beguines espousing mystical views that were considered unorthodox, they occasionally faced accusations of heresy. Council of Vienne in 1311–1312 even issued decrees condemning certain aspects of the Beguine way of life, though these were not universally enforced, and many Beonages continued to thrive with local support. Despite these pressures, the Beguine movement persisted for centuries, adapting to changing circumstances. Many Beonages eventually came under stricter church supervision or evolved into more formal religious congregations. The Beonages were truly unexpected havens. They offered medieval women a unique blend of spiritual community, economic self-reliance, and personal freedom. In a world that offered few such choices, these women carved out spaces where they could live according to their own conscience, support themselves through their own labor, and form strong, self-governing communities. They were not rebels in a political sense, but their way of life represented a quiet revolution in female autonomy and spiritual expression. The legacy of the Beguines is a powerful reminder of women's capacity to create innovative social and spiritual alternatives, even in seemingly restrictive historical contexts. These were sanctuaries built by women, for women, fostering a spirit of independence and devout community that remains inspiring. Number 1. The sacred keepers of Rome's eternal flame, the Vestal Virgins. The very pinnacle of our list, and perhaps one of the most astonishing examples of a haven offering unique status and power to unmarried women in the ancient world, we find the Vestal Virgins of Rome. For over 1,000 years, from roughly the 7th century before Common Era until the late 4th century Common Era, a small group of elite priestesses held one of the most sacred and respected positions in Roman society, all while remaining unmarried and by solemn vow. Their role was not just ceremonial. It was believed to be crucial to the very survival and prosperity of Rome itself. The Vestals were priestesses of Vesta, the Roman goddess of the hearth, home, and family. Their primary duty was to tend the sacred fire in the Temple of Vesta, located in the heart of the Roman Forum. This fire was never allowed to go out, as its extinction was believed to signify a terrible omen for the city, portending disaster. They also performed other vital rituals, prepared sacred substances like mola sausa, a salted flour mixture used in sacrifices, and guarded important sacred objects and state documents, including wills of prominent Romans, kept within the temple precincts. How did one become a Vestal? Girls were chosen for this prestigious role between the ages of 6 and 10. They had to be free-born daughters of patrician families, though later plebeians were also admitted, and physically perfect, with both parents living. Pontifex Maximus, Rome's chief priest, would select them by lot from a group of candidates. Once chosen, a girl would leave her family and enter the Atrium Vestae, the House of the Vestals, a grand residence adjacent to the Temple of Vesta. Here, she would serve for a minimum of 30 years. The first 10 years were spent learning the intricate rituals and duties from older Vestals. The next 10 years were dedicated to performing these duties, and the final 10 years were spent teaching the new initiates. The life of a Vestal Virgin was one of extraordinary privilege, but also immense responsibility and strict rules. Their vow of chastity was paramount. If a Vestal broke this vow and was found to have engaged in sexual relations, the punishment was terrifyingly severe. She would be buried alive in a subterranean chamber in a place called the Campus Scalaritus, the evil field with a small amount of food and water, a symbolic gesture as it was forbidden to spill a Vestal's blood. Her male partner would be flogged to death. Such occurrences were rare but were treated with utmost seriousness, as a Vestal's impurity was thought to pollute the state and anger the gods. However, the privileges and honors afforded to Vestals were unparalleled for women in Rome, a deeply patriarchal society where most women lived under the legal guardianship of their father or husband. Vestals were legally autonomous. They could own property, make a will, and give evidence in court without a male guardian. They traveled through the city in a covered litter, and even consuls and praetors were required to make way for them, preceded by a lictor, a kind of bodyguard and attendant. If a Vestal encountered a condemned criminal being led to execution, she had the power to pardon him, provided the encounter was accidental. They had seats of honor at public games and state ceremonies. They were in many ways living embodiments of Rome's sanctity and continuity. The Atrium Vestae itself was a luxurious complex with multi-story apartments, courtyards, and amenities. The Vestals lived a communal life, supported by the state. They were revered by the populace. Their prayers were considered particularly efficacious. Their very presence was a symbol of purity and divine favor. After completing their 30 years of service, a Vestal was free to leave the priesthood and marry. They often received a substantial dowry from the state and were considered highly prestigious marriage partners. However, many chose to remain in service to Vesta, having grown accustomed to their respected status, independence, and the community of their fellow priestesses. For these women, the Atrium Vestae was more than just a place of duty. It was their home, their community, and the source of their unique position in society. Why was this a haven? While the life was demanding and the penalties for transgressions severe, the Vestal priesthood offered a select group of women a level of public status, legal independence, and religious authority that was simply unattainable for other Roman women. In a world where a woman's identity was largely defined by her male relatives and her role in procreation, the Vestals stood apart. They were unmarried, childless by vow, yet they were not marginalized. Instead, they were elevated, entrusted with the spiritual well-being of an empire. Their lives were dedicated to a sacred purpose that transcended the ordinary, and in return, they received protections, privileges, and a degree of autonomy that made their position one of the most unique and powerful havens for unmarried women in all of history. Their eternal flame may have been extinguished with the rise of Christianity in the late 4th century, but the legacy of the Vestal Virgins as powerful independent female figures endures.